It happens to me a lot. My hunch is it happens to you every now and then too. I'll be at a dinner party, or standing in line at the grocery store, or waiting in a doctor's waiting room. One time it happened to me while I was riding on a bus at Disney World. Someone strikes up a conversation. We're talking about regular things that regular people talk about. The weather, sports. Where'd you get that shirt you have on? When all of a sudden, they ask me, so what do you do for a living? When I answered that I'm a minister, the conversation always changes. Where once our discussion topics might have ranged far and wide, from the price of tea in China to the mysteries of cricket in India to the relative merits of beef versus pork barbecue, now there can be only one topic: the church. They tell me about their own preacher. Sometimes they like the guy, sometimes not so much. They tell me about their worship services and about all the mission projects their church is involved in. They tell me about the missionaries they support and about the number of children in their vacation Bible school programs in the summer. Or sometimes they ask me questions about things in the Bible that they don't understand, or they might ask my advice on problems that they've been having in their own congregations. And it's not that I'm not interested in having these conversations, it's just that these things are not all that interest me. It's the strangest phenomena, I think, that when folks find out I'm a minister, they seem to change a little. And it's not just that all they'll talk to me about is churchy things. Their behavior changes too. They'll begin to tell me a joke and then remember the punchline and think, oh, not that one. They will heavily edit their stories to leave out details of which they think I might not approve. Sometimes, if they have a drink in their hand, they'll either set it down or apologize for it. Maybe it's because they don't usually get to talk to someone about their faith very much. Maybe it's because they think that as a minister I'll judge them if they don't prove their worth as a Christian to me fast enough. I'm not really sure, to be honest. But typically I listen, and I participate in the conversation as much as I can. But after a while, it gets a little frustrating because, frankly, well, I'm more than a minister. I think a lot of you have experienced similar things. The banker, who always gets roped into talking about finance. The doctor, who gets asked for free medical advice at every turn. The government employee, who's always having to talk about public policy. Those things are a part of who we are, but they're not all of who we are. Now, don't get me wrong, I love the church. I'm not ashamed of being a minister. I love Jesus as much as the next guy. But being a minister is only part of who I am. There's a lot more to me. For instance, I'm a son of the South. I'm Bill and Cheryl's boy. I'm Mary's husband and Will Gray and Harry's father. I'm a graduate of the University of South Carolina, go Cox, a fan of bacon, and a big fan of the Beatles. And yes, I am a huge Star Wars nerd. But if we never sat down and talked, or if I did not have this particular forum for sharing my thoughts with you, you might never know any of those things about me. And that's part of a larger problem, I think. We rarely get the opportunity to learn about the people with whom we interact on a daily basis. We see glimpses. We get flashes of identity, tidbits. We see only what's on the surface. But we are more than what can be seen and understood in a brief encounter. Each of us is a complex individual formed by experiences and relationships that help to make us who we are. It takes time to get to know a person's nuances and perspectives on life. And in our world of high-speed internet and instant information, a world where we can have almost anything we want right now, where Facebook and Instagram sum up our lives in quick images and pithy comments, and Twitter has reduced public discourse to 140 characters, it seems that getting to know a person beyond what we can see on the surface has become a waste of time. So, we label folks. We put them in neat, concise categories that make it easier for us to understand them. That guy you met is a Republican or a Democrat, and that means that he fits into the mold of what you expect from a Republican or a Democrat, period. That woman, she's a Muslim, which means that she fits into the mold of what you expect from a Muslim, period. But the trouble with labels and with putting people into simple categories is that it allows us to see one another not as we are, but in the way that is most convenient. But what we learn in our New Testament passage this morning is that those labels and simple categories do not ultimately define us. There is another characteristic held in common by all people everywhere that should influence the way that we see one another and interact with one another, and that is our common identity as children of God. The writer of Acts tells us that on their way to pray, Paul and Silas pick up a shadow of sorts. They're followed around by a girl who is possessed by a spirit of divination. She can see the future. She's a fortune teller. And he was constantly shouting to anyone within earshot that Paul and Silas are God's servants. And like a teenager being followed around by his kid sister, Paul gets fed up with her, and in a fit of annoyance, he casts the spirit from her and sets her free. Now, what Paul has done is life-changing for this girl, but her owners are not happy about it, because for them, she had been a rich source of income. She'd been telling fortunes for money. It was a sort of first-century psychic friends hotline, if you're old enough to remember that reference. Though the girl was much better off after her encounter with Paul and Silas, her owners were angry because they had lost a perfectly good source of income. To them, this young slave girl only had value as long as she could make them money. What she could do totally and completely defined her. So, as a result, Paul and Silas were thrown into jail, put in the innermost cell, had their feet put in stocks to ensure that they would not be able to escape. But something miraculous happened. An earthquake shook the city so hard that those stocks fell right off their feet, and the gates of the prison, all of them, swung wide open. The jailer, awakened by all the commotion, was alarmed to find that his prison had been thrown open and his prisoners presumably had fled into the night. Now, the jailer assumed that the prisoners had fled. I mean, after all, what prisoner wouldn't take the opportunity to run if it presented itself? Especially ones who had been so unjustly imprisoned, like Paul and Silas. And had Paul and Silas been members of the U.S. military, they would have been bound by Article 3 of the U.S. Military Code of Conduct, which states, if I am captured, I will make every effort to escape and to aid others to escape. But Paul and Silas did not run for one very simple reason. Because they saw the jailer as more than a jailer. And they knew that his life depended on them staying put. See, the story tells us that he was about to kill himself. But that's because in the Roman Empire, a jailer who allowed his prisoners to escape would have been put to death anyway. Now, there's no word on what would have happened had the prisoners returned at a later date. But clearly, if Paul and Silas run, the jailer dies. But who cares about the jailer, right? He's one of the bad guys. He's cannon fodder. If this is a Star Trek movie, he's a guy in a red shirt. He's not going to last. Paul and Silas are the good guys. Anything to get them free, right? They could have been excused for escaping and leaving the jailer to his fate, except that to Paul and Silas, the jailer was more than their captor. He was more than an agent of Rome. He was more than a bad guy. He was a child of God. And so they stay, and he lives. And then the author of the story reveals to us something very important, that he is also a father. Yes, he has a family. And we begin to see that Paul and Silas leaving the jail would have been so much more tragic than we previously thought. And so we breathe a collective sigh of relief, thankful that Paul and Silas saw him as more than a jailer, that Paul and Silas saw him as a child of God. You see, we get wrapped up in labels and in categories, and we begin to see people in their simplest form, their simplest terms that are easy for us to manage. We reduce people to their religion or their political affiliation or their career, and sometimes we do that with very tragic consequences. Now, we don't do it on purpose. In a fast-paced world, it's just quicker and easier that way. And while labels and categories can help us to make quick bonds with a stranger on a bus or to get an easy medical opinion on that weird rash on your arm, that label that should define our relationships with other people always, all the time, both stranger and friend alike, is the label that says child of God. Who are you? Who are you? You can probably answer that question a million different ways. You can choose to emphasize some things, to de-emphasize others. But there's one answer to that question that each of us shares in common. We are each of us a child of God. We are made by God, lovingly crafted in God's own image. We bear a small spark of the divine. And we are, each of us, loved and cherished by the God who made us. And that truth shall always illuminate and always influence every other answer you can possibly give to that question. To God be all glory, honor, power, and dominion in this world and in the world that is to come. Amen.